Here we are again with another aviation and whatever else comes out of it show with Paul Brennan in Wellington and...
Martin Noakes reporting from the mean streets of Melbourne.
Are you out on the street, are you?
I'm actually out on the street. The telephone reception in the room is rubbish and the internet's so expensive. I'm out on the streets.
Oh, isn't Australia wonderful?
It's not windy, which is nice.
Oh, it's not windy in Wellington either, you'd be surprised to hear.
I am surprised to hear it, actually.
It's a nice laid-back day, but I tell you what, those cicadas are just so loud.
So you've got good weather over there, do you?
Yeah, don't sound so surprised, eh? All right, There's only one thing on everyone's lips. And Martin, our clip today is a piece of video I took at Adelaide back in 2000, and you can't see this because you're on the street of Melbourne right now, but for our YouTube viewers of this audio podcast, this is the second Malaysian Airlines 777-200ER to be delivered to them, push back and taxi out at Adelaide, given that, of course, this is the sort of aircraft that's missing at the moment. And there are a few other aviation stories, and maybe we'll get to those before the end of the program, but it's MH370, went missing on the 8th of March. What are we now? 20th.
20th, yeah. It's an incredible event that a plane can just disappear like that. And the conspiracy theorists are going mental, aren't they?
Yeah, but that also includes, it seems, the official or mainstream US media.
That's true. They've all become conspiracy theorists.
I guess Fox is not mainstream. CNN certainly is. There seems to, and we can obviously touch on this too because it's one of the phenomenons you get from a situation like this, the sort of the division in the styles of reporting a story that really at this point has no end. It has no sort of full stop, and it's my impression, and I'm sure it's yours if you've been watching it, that the sort of Europeanized media is a lot more fact-based in its reporting. But you watch the American media, and it's like it's NCIS or some sort of anti-terror talkback show. So that's fascinating in itself.
Well, they've got to drive those ratings, don't they?
So, okay, the aircraft takes off from Kuala Lumpur, heads north, Beijing. They do it every night, that flight. And I see they've changed the flight number for that now, out of respect to the relatives, they say. And they do a sign-off, they say good night. Some people have been even trying to say that that's unusual, but of course everyone says good night during the handover. Yeah. And then that's it. No more. That's it. Pings to a satellite for hours afterwards, but apart from that, essentially they disappear.
Yes. Gone. Absolutely gone.
But where?
Well, of all the theories, and if you want to get into theories, of all the theories, the one that I think is most likely that the plane had a disabling fire on board that wasn't strong enough to burn through the structure. It continued off on autopilot or just naturally flew on and is probably in the bottom of the Southern Ocean somewhere. I don't think it landed anywhere. I don't think it's been hijacked. I think it's gone.
Well, I tend to agree with you on that. It's just that, was it a fire? Was it some sort of other failure? There are plenty of historical precedents for all sorts of things that can happen. We've talked about Swissair 111 before. Well, there's an example, though that didn't go on flying about for hours afterwards. No,
it didn't. But there are instances of planes flying off on their own for quite a long time after an incapacitated crew. There was that Greek airliner, the 737. How long did that fly? A couple of hours.
Helios 522. Yeah, a couple of hours, and they were looking through the windows at the people.
Yeah, they had an F-16 up next to it, didn't they?
Did I just hear a Melbourne tram in the background there, Martin?
Yes, you did. I'm at the bottom of Burke Street, and there's trams going by all the time.
Then we can believe you that you are, in fact, in Melbourne, because where else would you get a Melbourne tram sound in the background?
Absolutely.
One thing I read that was interesting, let's talk about theories, because that's what is on everybody's mind. QF30, you remember 2008, I think it was, Hong Kong, Melbourne, 747-400.
Yeah.
An oxygen bottle lets go under the cargo floor in the forward hold, punches a hole through the floor, damages a door, lodges in the roof, and down below, the cylinder part has blown out a 1.5 by 2 metre hole just forward of the wing join, and they had to head to Manila. In fact, I think the nickname for that plane now is the Manila Bomber. And it was quite a bad situation. The anti-skid brakes were affected. Some of the data lines through the aircraft were cut. And they were lucky they got it on the ground. But what happens to the oxygen bottle under the floor in the cockpit if that happens?
I don't know. To be honest, I don't know.
Well, they never found out why that happened.
They're still working on it, aren't they? They're still trying to find out the root cause of that accident.
And you can imagine that a valve, I'm not saying this is the what happened, but this is another potential scenario. The valve leaves the bottle like it did in the QF30 and punches its way through the floor and into, well, whatever's above it, and maybe even the cockpit, injuring someone, while the bottle blows out the area near the nose gear wheel well.
Yeah.
And suddenly you've got you saw the hole on the QF, there was a big hole. Suddenly you've got explosive but non-airframe destructive decompression going on, and those guys may have never had a chance to get a mask on.
No. With oxygen venting into the system, though, the chance of fire is quite high, and if there'd been an oxygen fire, the plane would have broken up. They're hot. It would have burned through structure.
Well, look what happened in Cairo a few years ago with that 777-200 and the oxygen system in the cockpit, supposedly, because they didn't get to the bottom of that one either, catching fire. That melted a hole in the side of the plane.
Yeah, it goes through aluminium. It's not very thick, and oxygen burns hot, bright and hot. Not for long, but long enough to burn through the aluminium of the structure. So I think if it had been an oxygen fire, it wouldn't have flown on for much longer. The top theory for me, and I read this, I think it was on Sunday, it's a 777 pilot, an American guy actually said, if you look at Google Earth, you'll see the plane diverted from track, started turning left. Well, he says if you look at a map of the Malay Peninsula, he says as a pilot, when you're flying around, you're always got an eye out for alternates. You're always looking for a place you can put the plane down. A good pilot always has in the back of his mind places where you can put the plane down in case something happens. Now, the direction the plane turned onto was right towards a Malaysian Air Force runway, 13,000 foot long Malaysian Air Force runway, that sticks out into the sea off the coast of Malaya to the north of where they were. He says, looking at the track, the way the plane started turning left, he reckons they were aiming for that airport. Now, his leading theory out of all of this is a hot day or hot night, heavy plane, underinflated nose wheel tire, starts smoldering, puts the wheel up. It would take a long time, but that would produce an incredible amount of smoke. Within minutes would seep into the cockpit. Now, when smoke comes in, the pilots going on oxygen doesn't help them because they can't see, and in the event of a fire, they're not actually meant to go onto oxygen because that could make the whole thing worse. So his theory is that the cockpit filled with smoke incapacitated the crew, the fire took out all the electronics, which would turn the thing off, and the plane basically just flew off on its own, and that was it. There is some evidence that the plane climbed to 40-something thousand feet. He says that might have been the pilots climbing to reduce the oxygen content of the air to try and put the fire out. Failing that, the plane would have just flown on either under autopilot or just being in stable flight would have just carried on, hence the possible trip out over the Southern Ocean where it fell into the sea eventually. He doesn't think it went north because India, Pakistan, all those places have got primary radar. They've got defense systems. It would have been seen. So he reckons it was a smouldering fire, incapacitated the crew, plane flew on, now at the bottom of the sea. Very difficult to find because you could say, oh yeah, but something would have floated up by now. Yeah, in the southern Indian Ocean, there's not a lot of people down there. Yeah, it might well be floating around, but you're not going to see it.
Well, of course, there is a precedent. Again, I think there was a DC-8 out of Nigeria some years ago that had a tyre fire and basically took it out of the air about half an hour, 40 minutes after they took off. Or it might have been a slightly less than that, but a similar sort of scenario. You don't buy the suspicion of the crew?
No, I don't. You know, if you look hard enough, you'll always find somebody's done something a little bit odd, but I don't think so. I don't think you'd do it like that. If you wanted to make a political statement, you wouldn't make a plane disappear. It always comes down to the Occam's razor or the KISS principle. Keep it, simple and stupid. It's generally going to be something pretty dumb that causes it.
Yes, some people were asking why wouldn't you return to Kuala Lumpur? I think in response to the theory that you just talked about from that chap, I think he's a Canadian guy by the name of Goodfellow. Why didn't they go to Kuala Lumpur? Well, there are 8,000-foot mountains in the way. That's why. Yeah,
exactly. And this military runway plugs right out into the sea. It's easy to land at. It's right there and relatively close. That's the runway anybody would have headed for.
Also, I've read that the 777 isn't capable of getting to 45,000 feet at that weight.
Yeah, but he seems to think it could. It depends on the density altitude in that, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a real stretch.
Or by that stage, it was already in that, what do they call it, the phugoid or whatever. They'd already lost control and it was just drifting around on its own.
Well, that could happen because you could, potentially get up the energy to do that
Yeah,
if the waves were big.
yeah. And it's like that Japan Airlines plane that lost all control, that 747. When was that, back in the 70s or 80s?
80s, yeah.
Yeah, that flew on for a long time. And the
45
Fugoids,
minutes. 45
yeah,
it was, yeah.
and the Fugoids just got steadily uncontrollable. And that was a plane that had control system damage. This plane didn't necessarily have any control system damage. It was just unstable flight, good conditions. It could have flown on for a long time, and it appears that it did.
And fly-by-wire usually returns to wings level and, straight and level flight, doesn't it?
Yeah, because those old 747s, that JAL one, didn't have any of that. It was an old manual plane, so that's why it slowly got worse and worse. Because, as you point out, the fly-by-wire system will naturally dampen any of that.
Yeah. So why do you think then there's this, I come back to the way that the world is talking about this, why do you think there's that division between very logical and less dramatic explanations with historical precedents, albeit they're never the same, and this whole idea of it being stolen and taken to some, deserted World War II airstrip in the Middle East somewhere, only to be, packed with explosives and flown off for some attack? I mean, that's really what they're trying to say, isn't it?
That's exactly what they're trying to say, and it makes good copy, doesn't it? It's exciting stuff.
And also, the relatives are holding out for any little bit of hope. And when you're talking about something possibly being on the ground, that could be a torturous situation. It's interesting. Also, the Malaysian authorities have been criticised for the way they've released information on this. And there were contradictory bits of information coming out progressively. But, I mean, that's what we'd call the fog of war, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, they just don't know. So in the event of not knowing anything, they're unsure, and they get a bit mixed up, stress and all the rest. And they got the pressure of the passengers. They can't tell them anything, so I guess they're just trying to make sure they don't tell them the wrong thing. And of course, by not knowing anything and not wanting to tell them the wrong thing, they have actually told them the wrong thing, or at least given them the wrong message.
What about the loss of face part of the culture? Basically, Malaysia's having to admit that their monitoring around their coast and their readiness, their alert level is pretty low, pretty relaxed, obviously.
Yes, well, any regime or government that likes to think it's in complete control never likes to admit that it actually is completely out of control. So, yeah, that is a bit embarrassing because they spend a lot of money on their Air Force. They're very proud of their Air Force, and it appears that a lot of it doesn't work.
Yeah. And the timeline on, who switched what off, and that's another thing that people have been talking about. A fire is one thing. In a decompression situation and a hypoxia situation, you can start to explain what looked like illogical acts.
Yes, absolutely. That's right. It's going to be one of those two things. Either there's a fire, and more than likely, towards the end, it would have been a combination.
Well, if there was an oxygen fire that was similar to the Cairo situation, that would have burnt probably a hole through that part of the fuselage by the cockpit windows, like it did. And it only took 3 minutes on the ground in Cairo for that to happen. And it may not have destroyed the aircraft, but it's enough to inflict a very severe situation localized on those two pilots.
Well, I think, you're cruising along at 500 knots, whatever it is, and you get a relatively small hole burnt through the front of the fuselage. It's going to rip the whole plane apart at that speed. Just the sheer volume of air coming in through the skin. Obviously, I have no more idea about this than anybody else. I doubt there was an oxygen fire.
You think the nose wheel thing makes sense, huh?
That seems to make the most sense, because that's the one thing that allows the plane to remain integral and continue on flying. And it would incapacitate the crew. They don't have the equipment for surviving in a very dense, smoky environment, and they don't use oxygen when there's a fire because they are worried about setting out. Hell, they might have even turned the oxygen system off.
So you've got an 18,000-hour captain who's flown in that part of the world, for that long, a long time. He knows it like the back of his hand, and I imagine the co-pilot does too. And the theory of him, having stored in real time progressively the airports going past him that he knows he can divert to in any sort of situation. Of course, you'd turn the aircraft immediately towards it, wouldn't you? That's the first thing you'd do, no matter what.
And despite all the stories coming out about Malaysia and how bad it is and everything, it's a good airline.
Yeah.
They're good pilots. I'm sure that's exactly what he was doing. He realized there was a problem. He was turning towards the airport exactly as he should.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, they didn't make it.
So you really need to look in the area on that heading, and then I guess if the autopilot ever disconnected, and that can happen too, you could slump on the column, and it only takes a couple of pounds of pressure, and the thing's disconnected. I guess the auto throttle, though, stays connected if it is in the loop, and that could create an interesting situation with the phugoids, because it'll keep adding power, subtracting, adding, and probably keep it in the air longer. But there's no reason it would have flown on in a straight line. It could have easily have gone into a slight turn, been hit by a sheer line of wind up that high or whatever that set it on a slightly different direction. So really, on his theory, it's pretty obvious where you've got to look, isn't it?
Yeah.
Here's the other thing. If it's never found, this will be one of those enduring conspiracy theory-filled mysteries that will travel on endlessly into time.
Well, they've got 10 million square miles, I think, to search for it. So it'll either pop up in Kazakhstan, which is very unlikely, or some fisherman will drag something in the next, 3 months, and that'll point to where it is. Something will come up, and I'm pretty sure it'll be something out of the southern Indian Ocean.
All right, then, let's move on to other news in aviation. I see the Emirates-Qantas tie-up has been good for Wellington. Martin, you've got the story there.
So Wellington has benefited from the Qantas Emirates alliance, which is seeing more long-haul passengers travelling to Wellington by the east coast of Australia rather than via New Zealand airport.
Interesting.
As a result, Qantas Tasmanian loadings have been the highest of any Wellington services, and they were not affected by the service cuts announced last week by Qantas in Australia.
Well, there you go. But that's not a huge gain for Qantas, I have to say, but there you go.
It's not a gain for Qantas at all, because everyone's just using it to connect with Emirates.
So Qantas are sort of doing it to themselves in a way.
When I come over here, the guys I work with, they spend a lot of time flying, and they're all Qantas Gold Club members and whatever, blah, blah, blah. They do all their flights on Emirates. They said the downside is you can't use the frequent flyer miles you collect on the Emirates flights for domestic. And the interesting thing is a lot of them use Virgin domestically and collect Star Alliance miles. And they are using their Qantas points to get them status within the Emirates system. But a couple of them are saying, listen, I'll just go over to the Emirates system soon and I'll just forget Qantas. Because if I'm not flying Qantas locally, I don't need Qantas points. And if I can't use my Emirates points locally, I really don't need Qantas points.
They must have anticipated that.
I don't think they did.
Wow.
I honestly don't think they did. I think they thought it would drive a lot of traffic to them, because it would make a much more, convenient service. So if you need to get to a city that Qantas doesn't serve, you could fly Emirates, and that's all wonderful, and you could get your Qantas miles. But most of the time you'd stick with Qantas because of loyalty and everything and blah, blah, blah. What's happening is people do one flight with Emirates and say, geez, this is a whole lot better than flying on the old Qantas bucket. That's it. We're flying Emirates. So Emirates are becoming the de facto international airline of Australia, it appears.
Well, that would have Qantas shareholders very worried, I would have thought.
They are very worried, especially when people are saying, and the whole loyalty thing really doesn't even cut it down to domestic, because Virgin offer a better product, and so we'll switch to them as well.
But good for Wellington.
Yeah, all those Jet Connect flights ferrying people over the east coast of Australia to pick up the Emirates flights, yeah. And actually, I think they'll find it's quite good for Air New Zealand, because as more and more people switch to Virgin, because I was speaking to a guy in the office yesterday, he switched over to Virgin recently, he does all his business flying within Australia using Virgin. He recently had to go to Toronto on business, and so he took the Air New Zealand flight to Vancouver. He said he'd never flown Air New Zealand before, first time.
Wow, okay.
He said previously he would always have flown Qantas to LA.
And then one world up to, So Air New Zealand is benefiting as well. Well, it's the worst of all worlds for Qantas then.
It really is, because this guy was saying he thought the Air New Zealand flight was fantastic. And he doesn't mind flying via Auckland. He says that's fine.
And just reported out of Australia and the Australian, former Qantas Chief Executive Jeff Dixon, he's calling for the total abolition of the Qantas Sale Act.
So over here, they're clutching at straws. They're desperately looking around for anything they can do to help Qantas. Whether lifting the restrictions on foreign ownership will help, I don't know. So it's interesting that Jeff Dixon would start going on about how to save Qantas, because he's getting quite a lot of bad press over here for the way he ran the airline with asset stripping and lack of investment and all that type of thing. So, yeah, they're getting themselves in a knot about it. And, in fact, the whole thing seems to have set Australia back a bit.
I see the unions are meeting with the Prime Minister and the opposition leader and also the Greens leader in Canberra. And Jeff Dixon is saying that industrial relations, and here's the quote, was always a problem.
Was always a problem, yes. And the project I've come over to perhaps be involved in the whole thing is around and probably going to be focused around industrial relations. It's not helping them as it should.
Yeah, it's the one thing that they've really never addressed in all these years. I mean, some people would say that's sort of good of them because they, it's for the worker. But, I mean, if you're that inflexible that a company can't change to fight for its very survival, there is a problem.
Yes, as you've seen, all the car companies, they said it was industrial relation tax were the two things that scuppered them, basically. Now, whether that's true, I don't know, but that's what they're saying.
Speaking of alliances, Auckland Airport is urging the government to consider closely the threat posed to competition on the Auckland-Singapore route with the Air New Zealand-Singapore Airlines get together, and they've made a submission to the Ministry of Transport saying they're generally supportive of the proposal, but they say the airline's assertion that the alliance will not affect the overall level of competition on the route needs to be tested. Jetstar is the only other airline that provides direct flights on the route. Well, no one else is going to do it. I mean, that's about it, isn't it?
Yeah, no one else is going to do it, no.
Why would they whinge about this?
I read that as well, and I don't understand it. What do they hope to get out of it? Do they hope to stop the flights, Air New Zealand tying in with Singapore? Really? It made me start thinking, what is the role of the airport? Is it to provide people an easy way to get to and fro the country, or is it a way to keep their shareholders happy? And I think they're focusing on the shareholders.
I think they always have.
Yeah, obviously, yeah. And you just said, guys, shut up, you're an airport.
Yeah, do what airports do, please.
Yes, stop trying to turn yourself into a mall with a runway.
Big story here, A380, raising the floor of the A380 to put another, to take it to what, 11 abreast, is that what they're saying?
Yes, they want to go to 11 abreast, and by raising the floor slightly over the widest part of the aeroplane, they can get 11 across, but still keep the 18-inch seat width. So you'd still have more space than on a 10 abreast 777, but you'd have 11 seats across. Which, having experienced 5 across the middle in a Delta L1011 TriStar, I submit it wasn't great.
No.
No one wants to be in the middle. It's a long way to the aisle. Serving food is interesting. People had to pass it along,
Yeah. Could you please pass my meal along? I'm starving.
That's what they were doing, yeah.
That's great for Emirates because basically the seat width and the comfort is more than the 777 fleet, even with that extra seat in there.
They'd add another 35, 40 seats. So there's no impingement upon their business class or first class product. So they can carry just as many business class seats, just as many first class seats. They get an extra 40 to 60 possibly economy class seats at the same width, which is wider than the 777. So they're figuring that everyone will be happy. But it's not Emirates which is driving this. Apparently it's that...
the leasing company. Yeah, the
leasing company. Yeah. So.
And they've got 20 on order, haven't they?
Yes.
Well, we're sort of running out of time. The talk on the MH370 took up quite a bit. Just a quick mention, and it'll have to be quick, but folks might want to go and find out more. Our aircraft of the day, it first flew on the 10th of July 1947. You and I have discussed this plane before. It's one of the best looking out there. It's the Airspeed AS57 Ambassador.
Beautiful, isn't it?
Beautiful aircraft.
Yeah, sleek. Well, last of the piston airliners, really, wasn't it? It was the last gasp of British piston airliners.
And it was a real attempt at a European-capable regional airliner. It was fast. Introduction to service was 1951 for British European Airways. Only 23 built.
Oh, it's typical English, isn't it? Yeah, why build a lot? Yeah, a big plane, but only took 60 people.
Yeah, 47 to 60. Of course, the famous incident was involved with, I think it was at Munich, with the soccer team on board, and it got caught in the ice on the runway or slowed down and stalled on takeoff and crashed, and I think most of them were killed. It was quite a bad crash. Yeah, the Manchester United, exactly. So, yeah, the last of the piston regional airliners, a beautiful looking plane, 3 tails, of course, remember, 3 tails?
Yes, why not, If one's good, 3 must be better.
Yeah, I remember someone telling me a joke up at one of the air shows. The Super Connie pilots really had it going on because they had to control 3 tails.
Yeah.
An old sexist, probably, by today's standards, aviation joke. Yeah, so the Airspeed Ambassador, our aircraft of the day. Pity we didn't have more time to speak about it, but for those who want to go have a look, it is a lovely plane to have a look at, and I think they've got a few videos on YouTube, old promotional videos of it flying around as well. Well, anyway, that's all we've got time for. That's us for another fortnight.
If anyone wants to comment or get a hold of us, our email address is airside.media@gmail.com.
What do you reckon, Martin? They'll have this aircraft found by the time we chat next time?
Gee, I wouldn't like to say, given the way it's gone so far.
All right. Well, Paul Brennan here in the sunshine and the cicadas in Wellington, and
Martin Noakes in the sunshine and trams in Melbourne.
we'll see you again in a fortnight.
Yes, see you later.